NEPR-AP-2018-0004 in re the unbundling of the assets of the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority. I am Attorney Dennis L. Hammer and have been designated as the hearing examiner for today's hearing. We are holding this evidentiary hearing remotely as a precaution to avoid the spreading of COVID-19. This morning, we are joined by Associate Commissioners Ángel Rivera de la Cruz, Lilian Mateo Santos, and Silvia Ugarte Arujo. We are going to excuse today Edison Aviles Delis, Chairman of the Energy Bureau of the Puerto Rico Service Regulatory Board, as well as Ferdinand Ramos Sogar, who is an Associate Commissioner. On February 5th, 2021, the Energy Bureau issued a resolution and order through which it established a procedural calendar for the instant case. Said procedural calendar monitors closely the work being performed by the Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority and its consultants in order to file its proposal for an unbundled rate for wheeling. Further, as part of the February 5th order, the Energy Bureau established the date of this initial evidentiary hearing. On May 10, 2021, PREPA filed before the Energy Bureau its motion in compliance with resolution and order entered February 5, 2021. The Energy Bureau determined that the filing was insufficient and required additional revised information from PREPA, which PREPA filed on May 17, 2021. On May 18, 2021, the Energy Bureau held an initial technical conference as scheduled in the February 5th order. On July 15, 2021, the Energy Bureau issued a resolution and order through which it established the agenda for this evidentiary hearing. The Energy Bureau established a witness schedule for the evidentiary hearing. The Energy Bureau will strictly adhere to the time allocated to each witness and panel. Each session will consist of questions directed at specific witnesses. Witnesses will not read their testimonies nor make an opening statement. All sessions will begin with questions by the Energy Bureau to the witnesses, followed by questions from the interveners, and lastly, questions from PREPA Luma. This evidentiary hearing will be conducted in English and will be recorded in audio and video. Further, it is being streamed live in both English and Spanish through the Energy Bureau's YouTube channel. A copy of the recording of the technical conference will be made part of the administrative file of this case and will be available in the Energy Bureau's website. We will now establish the instructions to be followed in this evidentiary hearing. Before addressing the Energy Bureau, please unmute your microphone. Before answering any questions or addressing the Energy Bureau, all participants must identify themselves for the record by stating their full name, by stating and the entity they represent. Please keep your microphones on mute while not answering questions or addressing the Energy Bureau in order to avoid disturbances due to background noise. Now we're going to proceed to take the oath of Margaret Everett from Guy House. That's going to be the witness for the morning's panel. Margaret, are you here? Are you online?
Yes, I am.
Good morning. I'm sorry. This is Margarita Mercado for Luma. I just want to clarify that witness name is Margot Everett, not Margaret.
Okay, Margaret Everett. Sorry.
Thank you.
Margaret, do you affirm that the testimony that you will provide today is true, correct, and based on your own personal knowledge, and that to the best of your understanding, none of the information you will provide today is misleading or untruthful?
I do.
Okay. I will go through the list of the interveners in this case and ask who's present. Independent Consumer Protection A Office.
Yes, this is Attorney Pedro Vasquez on behalf of the ICPO.
Good morning.
Morning.
Ecoeléctrica. Ecoeléctrica. Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. Puerto Rico Manufacturers. Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica de la Montaña. Well, as established in the agenda, and I need to mention, sorry, that Paul Shernick and Mark Lebel of the Energy Bureau are the technical consultants that will join us today, and they will be in charge of asking questions to the witnesses. However, the commissioners may ask questions at any given time. So therefore, we're gonna then proceed with the calendar as scheduled. The first issue in the agenda is the cost of service study methods and data sources, implementation of unbundling tariffs, status of PREPA, generating units and data collection capabilities. Also, I want to remind all parties that whenever you guys file a motion, please notify the other parties so they are aware of what's going on. It is my understanding that there were two motions filed last night or during the weekend, one by the Independent Consumer Protection Office, and I think Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica, if I'm not mistaken, notifying the Bureau that they intend to ask questions to the Bureau. So I'm just letting the witness know of that petition, but want to remind the parties to please notify everyone involved in the case. So now I'm gonna let
I'm sorry, Attorney Selhammer, Margarita
Yeah.
Mercado for Luma. Thank you for that clarification. Just for the record, I want to say that the Luma did not receive those petitions, and one of them was received this morning from the Bureau. And I think the petition to ask questions was filed yesterday, Sunday, July 18th, and the notice to on Friday, the 15th. The notices to ask questions, just for the record.
Okay, thank you. So now we're gonna let Mr. Level ask questions to the witness, and after that, like the agenda, like instructions dictated, then the parties will have, the interveners will have the opportunity, and also PREPA or Luma if they desire to. So go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark LaBelle. I'm an associate with the Regulatory Assistance Project, working as a technical consultant for the Energy Bureau. Good morning, Ms. Everett. Thank you for joining us so early, I think early your time. Hopefully the sun is up where you are, but maybe not quite.
Not yet.
Not yet. All right. So most of my questions are clarifications on your discovery responses. And I'm going to try to go in order of how the questions came out, starting with set one. Particularly starting with set 1, question 6, part E. Sorry, the notation here is a little cumbersome. This is the question where we're talking about the potential for earlier retirements of generation units due to lower peak demand. If you need a second to get to your response, that's fine.
Although for clarification, Mr. LaBelle, you're referencing the request for information by the Bureau. We did get one from the ICPO. I just want to make sure that the witness goes to the right file.
Yes, the first set from PREB. The numbering does get a little confusing because the ICPO was in the middle there. So set 2 from PREB is set 3 overall, and I will try to keep that consistent. All right, let me know when you're in the right location.
So is it, I'm sorry, is it set 1 or set 3?
It's set 1. It's
Set 1. Okay.
on page, the response is on page 10 out of 22 in the PDF. And the specific question is, can reducing PREPA's peak demands allow earlier retirement of some generation units?
Okay, yes. I'm in that location, yes.
Great. So the beginning to the response is perhaps. Does that indicate that there are some situations where earlier retirement can be facilitated by lower peak demand or lower load growth?
There's always a possibility of early retirements for various different reasons, and the lack of need for generation may be one of those. So an absolute no would have been incorrect on that statement. However, my understanding of the status of the units, the load requirements, it is highly unlikely that reducing peak demand would allow for earlier generation. Early retirement of generation, and in fact may accelerate some costs for things like decommissioning.
If a unit is scheduled to be retired sooner or later, won't those decommissioning costs be incurred sooner or later as well?
Yes, usually the decommissioning costs follow shortly after the plant is retired.
Okay. And then the next part of your response says that if a unit is retired earlier, there's only a cost savings if the plant is already fully depreciated. Can you explain that statement, please? Yes,
because if you retire a plant early and you have not fully recovered the cost of that plant, you still need to recover those costs. And those costs are embedded in the revenue requirement. And sometimes, depending upon accounting rules, you may have to accelerate the recovery of that revenue requirement. So the challenge is in retirements is that you still may have undepreciated plant that you need to recover, and therefore the revenue requirement would not change even if the plant is retired.
Okay, maybe I'm confused by the grammar, or maybe there's a miscommunication here. Are you so say a plant was paid for through the issuance of bonds, just to simplify things, that even if you retire the plant, you still have to pay back those bonds on the schedule you've agreed to? Is that the idea? But this is a fixed cost regardless of whether the plant is retired or not.
That's correct. There's the capital that was paid initially to build the plant, and also, for any plant enhancements that might have been done throughout the life of the plant. If those dollars had not yet been recovered and are still part of the balance sheet, basically, there's still costs that have to be recovered or they will be stranded, and they end up being, and those costs flow through into the revenue requirement.
Okay, but but in any case, those aren't the costs that are saved by retirement. Those are the costs that are incurred regardless of whether a plant is retired or not.
They are the costs regardless of whether the plant is retired. That's correct.
So those are essentially the fixed costs. Those are not the costs that get saved if a plant that could potentially get saved if a plant is retired, right?
True, but yes, there are But those costs flow through differently, I think, is the way to be careful about this. So I am referring to the fixed costs and the capital costs that are on the books for a plant that might get retired. If a plant is retired earlier because it's not needed, that actually gets reflected in your energy costs. There's not an additional savings. You might end up lowering the marginal cost because you've retired a plant that's more expensive, for example. So let's say you have a very expensive plant, you've retired it, you're never going to dispatch it again. Those dispatch costs then fall out of the supply stack.
Well, if it's a more expensive unit, presumably it wouldn't be running anyway in an efficient dispatch.
Correct.
All right. So what savings can occur from retirement of a unit?
Relative to so if the plant is not needed and not used, none. If the plant is deemed to be more expensive than an alternative and therefore is retired, that's already incorporated in the accounting that goes into the cost of service study. So, for example, if you're looking at a portfolio of plants and you've determined that, as you said, one of them is not economic and therefore can be shut down, presumably that plant was probably not being dispatched anyway. It's always relative to, the analysis is always relative to the alternative. So retirements really don't save and avoided costs because because you end, if you actually need that generation, you're paying upfront capital costs, and a lot of these plants in PREPA's portfolio, to my understanding, are near or fully depreciated. So you're really just talking about variable costs that these plants are incurring, and those variable costs would not occur if the plant's not being dispatched.
Well, what about fixed O&M? There's operating and maintenance expenses of having a building and all sorts of other things that occur regardless of the dispatch of that unit on site. Is fixed O&M reduced or eliminated by retiring a plant, selling the land?
Certainly selling land and some O&M costs would be saved, but they would potentially be offset by decommissioning costs. It really is a plant by plant assessment. And again, as I mentioned, when you think about how the treatment of these costs flow into a cost of service analysis, this is all being done upstream, and it's being done in the IRP, the integrated resource planning process. And what you're doing in that process is you're making this assessment that says, I have this load that I need to cover, and I have these resources that I can use to cover it, and here's the cost of doing so. If there's an opportunity to retire a plant because it's not needed, and the cost savings of that plant are relevant, that would flow into the cost of service study. So to the extent that those decisions have been made in the IRP, they would be included in the cost of service study that we've provided and would not be incremental to anything that we submitted in the cost of service.
Well, what if an order for providing for an integrated resource plan going forward provides flexibility for updates and smart decision making as load growth or other circumstances evolve?
You're saying that what if that's a process that's put in place?
What if an order for an IRP and an action plan coming out in our IRP allows for flexibility and changes to retirement schedules or timing for new generation?
This is Attorney Mercado for the record. For clarification, this is a hypothetical question, not grounded on the cost of service study that was filed, right? Your question is a hypothetical.
Well, I believe my question is an accurate reflection of the current order issued on the IRP last year, where there is discretion for the generation operator, PREPA, at the time, to make changes or updates or file different documents with the Bureau reflecting schedules for retirements of units or different timelines for build outs of different units, depending on load growth, prices for solar and battery storage. that the IRP order and the process laid out in that order was not actually a specific plan, but rather had significant elements of discretion where PREPA could optimize.
And we're going to allow the question, Mr. Lebel. Please proceed.
So, so I think the thing to remember about cost of service studies is that they are always done at a moment in time and they are a forecast. And so while there may be that sort of flexibility allowable, it would not find its way into a cost of service study unless it was explicitly predicted as part of the expectations of what the costs are going to be. So in other words, cost of service studies take a look at a moment in time and say, what are the costs that we expect? How do I classify those costs? How do I allocate those costs? And as you bring in a hypothetical retirement, for example, that would be a scenario in a cost of service study. So while it could happen, it would not impact a cost of service study because the cost of service study does not run scenario. It is not a scenario-based analysis. It's just a forecast analysis.
But isn't the whole principle of marginal cost, even if you're just limited to load growth, isn't the whole principle of that how the generation owner or an operator would rationally respond with extra capacity in response to extra load growth? Isn't that an attempt to link how costs will change with a change in load?
I agree that a change in load and the change in costs.
I was just gonna state an objection, and I believe the question was argumentative with the witness.
Can you rephrase the question?
Happy to rephrase. When you're estimating a change in costs with load growth, is that not an estimate of how plans will change for the utility?
It is, but it's a forecast of that change. And I believe the example that you're providing it would be like a scenario. So in other words, there is an established plan of what what PREPA, the polar provider, is intending to spend over the next 10 years to meet reliability needs. And if those reliability needs will change, if load changes from what the forecast that's used in the cost of service or in that integrated resource planning process, then there would be a change. But my point is that so I want to differentiate between what the cost of service is doing versus ongoing marginal costs. And what I'm talking about is the cost of service study is computing an estimate of what marginal costs would be given inputs of load and decision making and planning in the IRP process. If load is different in the future, then it's possible that the decisions around plants would change. But what we're doing is we're creating an estimated relationship between what the expected change is given of load, given the expected resources. So, cost of service studies are just not that dynamic. If I were to compute something, it would be a hypothetical number that of avoided costs from O&M from a plant that might be retired, and that would not flow into rates. It might flow in through some sort of true-up mechanism or rate update, but not into the rates that way.
So if a utility is growing and it's projected to need capacity and you show a positive marginal generation capacity cost, let's just call it $1 a kilowatt just for simplicity's sake here, it doesn't particularly matter. What does that $1 a kilowatt represent?
That $1 a kilowatt represents an expectation that the utility has to build an incremental kilowatt of generation. There is an expectation about what type of generation that is. It could usually the IRPs also estimate that, and they would say, well, this is a combustion turbine. It's a baseload plant, whatever it might be, and there's a cost per kilowatt that's estimated to install that capacity. And that's what that dollar per kW represents. So again, that dollar per kW could be 90 cents a kW in reality because the utility was able to install that kW for less than what they anticipated. And the converse is true.
All right, I'm happy to move on to my next topic. Are there follow-ups? There appear to be. I think Paul turned on his camera at one point.
Well, we're gonna allow the Bureau's consultants to do the questions, and then other parties then can, after you guys are done, ask questions.
Oh no, sorry. I was asking whether Paul and I think one of the commissioners. I think Lillian turned on her camera at one point as well. I was just wondering if they had a follow-up on this specific topic.
Okay.
No, Mark, I think you've covered what we need to on this.
All right, thank you. All right, my next question is going on to the second. The second set of discovery responses from the Bureau, which is the third set overall.
Okay.
I have Attorney Mercado for Luma. I just want to say for the record, those that I know we provided responses to requests for information and discovery. I believe the questioning was gonna revolve around the pre-filed testimony as cross-examination. So I would ask that the questions be geared towards the pre-filed testimony and not go into other details that are not directly related to the direct testimony.
So looking at question 2 of set 2, we asked about a statement that was made in the cost of service study report, and I would like to get further clarification on exactly what was meant by the statement in the cost of service study report.
I just want to state a standing. I just don't want to keep interrupting, so it's my standing objection or request is that the questions be geared towards the direct testimony. I know there's many response to requests for information, so that would be I don't want to keep interrupting. That's why I interrupted them.
Attorney Mercado, this is Commissioner Mateo. I understand your objection, but we're going to keep asking what is in the direct testimony now, but if our consultants or any of the commissioners have questions that we understand are important to make a determination in the case and to have a complete administrative record, we're going to issue an order and ask for the people that provided the answers to appear and give testimony. The fact that the petitioner did not call them as witnesses does not completely preclude the Bureau from bringing them to the process if we understand that it is important for having a complete record. So I just wanted to let you know that, and hopefully we would not have to do that, but it is an option that we have, and if need be, we are going to exercise our discretion on that.
Thank you, Commissioner. And I do understand that the Bureau under Regulation 8543 has discretion on the manner to conduct. I just want to state for the record that discovery in this the pre-filed testimonies were due before discovery was issued. So Luma does reserve any rights to issue, to present arguments as to how the calendar was structured and maybe precluded filing of additional pre-filed testimony by Luma after discovery ended. So I do understand that you have discretion, and I don't want to, be arguing here some scenarios that haven't come up precisely, but I just want to state that for the record, that pre-filed testimonies were filed and discovery ended in June. The discovery answers were given in June per the calendar.
Duly noted. Thank you.
So, Mr. LaBelle, you can proceed with your line of questioning.
Thank you. So yes, question 2 in set 2 from the Bureau, which is set 3 overall. Part A is asking about the statement made in the cost of service study that NCP is best used for distribution because demands are locationally driven. Just a terminal. Let me know when you've gotten to the right spot.
I am there.
Thanks. So just a terminology clarification. So there's many different types of coincident peak or non-coincident peak. So in the course of the explanation here, you talk about class non-coincident peak. Can you explain what class non-coincident peak is in your terminology?
Yes, it is the hour. It is the energy in the hour where if you were to add up all of the load in a specific customer group, that is the highest load for that customer group. So some customer groups peak at different times than the system does, or each other. And so the non-coincident peak is when that group of customers peaks, and you can define those peaks of customers in a lot of the groups of customers in very different ways. They can be residential, they can be large commercial, and so on.
Great. But class NCP is different than what might be called customer NCP, where customer NCP is typically a bigger number that reflects the sum of all of the individual customers' non-coincident peaks. Is that correct?
An individual customer, if you were to add up the peak of every individual customer in a customer group, that would be greater than the peak of all those customers if you were to add up all their loads together and find the hour where all of those customers collectively peak. So yes, an individual customer's, the sum of every individual customer's peak is greater than the sum of the class. And the sum of the class NCPs is usually greater than the system peak.
Okay, thank you. My next set of questions is about set 2, question 11, which is set 3 overall, of course.
Is it on page, this is page 17?
Page 17 of the PDF, yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the statement in the cost of service study is the lack of a consistent pattern between MEC, which stands for marginal energy costs, and load is concerning. Can you explain why you'd expect to see such a correlation or consistent pattern?
Yes, normally you would expect marginal costs to follow load, because what you're doing when load is high, you're dispatching the more of your expensive plants, and when load is low, you're typically dispatching lower plants. So you would expect to see that during periods of time where customer demand on the system is high, that the costs to serve are higher because you're dispatching more expensive plants. And vice versa. So you would typically look at, there's usually very strong relationships between marginal energy costs, which is specifically, just to be clear, it's the cost of creating the kilowatt hour. So the capacity is already built. It doesn't include any of that, but you need to dispatch a unit to meet an incremental kilowatt hour of demand on the system. And so those marginal energy costs, in kind of typical economics, you're climbing that supply curve as your load increases. And so that's why you would expect to see that relationship.
Okay, thank you. Would you expect to see that relationship still if other independent variables in the model are changing?
Potentially. I mean, what typically breaks that correlation down is a region with a significant amount of solar energy or must-run energy that then creates a generation that, regardless of what load is doing. And so there are indications of that. I can't really think of other situations where that might be the case. Any other hypotheticals that might be the case?
What about maintenance schedules? Could that shift the dispatch curve and have it lead to a different relationship?
It does, but usually you would see that happening in months when load is low. So you would still, while you wouldn't necessarily see really, really low prices when load is low, you would still expect to see lower prices when load is low because plants are being dispatched. So if a plant is being dispatched in the spring, for example, the prices would not go down as far, and all that's what, and it also only holds true if those plants that are being serviced and that maintenance schedule of those plants is occurring in the low cost plants. So you're turning off a baseload plant for maintenance, and so you basically shifted down the supply curve. So that does happen periodically, but you would still expect prices to have sort of a pattern that's consistent with load, even in those situations.
Were you able to examine the inputs of the Aurora modeling to understand whether there were issues like the ones we were just discussing?
No.
Okay. All right. Happy to move on to my next area of questions, the embedded cost allocation of the FCA and PPCA costs. We can start with set 2 from the Bureau, question 13, which is very, very closely nearby here.
Okay.
So I think we were asking a simpler question. What does renewable parentheses as generated close parentheses mean?
So renewable energy typically occurs when the renewable fuel, sun, wind, is available. And these plants are typically dispatched when those fuels are available. And to say they're dispatched is actually a little bit loose with the language, that it basically they run when the fuel is available, and that energy shows up for the system operator to include. And just, to put this in context, a lot of renewable rich jurisdictions will actually consider renewable load as a reduction to, renewable generation as a reduction to load, as opposed to a quote unquote dispatch generation. But that's what we mean by renewable as generated. It's appearing when the fuel is available. Same is true, by the way, for hydro. If the hydro facility cannot be curtailed. In other words, like, I think some sort run of river hydro is another example of as generated resource.
Okay, so how is your calculation of renewable as generated different from the nameplate capacity of the unit? Just take one, say we have 100 kilowatt solar unit, the nameplate capacity, how would renewable as generated be different than 100 kilowatts?
In part because of whether or not the fuel is actually available at the time. So the nameplate capacity implies what the unit is capable of generating, and whether or not the fuel is available at a level that allows the plant to generate at its maximum amount. So 100 kW plant could be producing at 100 kW, or it could not be producing at all.
Okay, I think what we're looking for here is there a reference in the spreadsheet where that calculation is literally done, or some? I'm happy to take this response later if you don't have it offhand. But I think we're looking to understand where the calculation to translate from nameplate capacity or whatever other measurement you have of those renewable resources to renewable as generated. Literally what those mathematical formulas are.
Right. So I can tell you what the mathematical formula is, but I will tell you that we did not calculate these numbers. So what we're referring to with nameplate capacity factor, and I apologize if I'm saying something that's so blatantly obvious to folks, but so the capacity factor is the ratio of the total kilowatt hours that a plant generates in a specific period of time, let's say over a specific number of hours, let's say hypothetically a year, divided by the capacity of that plant times the number of hours in that same period. So a plant that has a 20% capacity factor generates kilowatt hours equal to the nameplate capacity on an expected value about 20% of the time. Is a way to think about it.
Okay, so say that if there's a 100 kilowatt nameplate capacity solar unit and it has a capacity factor of 20%, the renewable as generated capacity that you're using is 20 kilowatts.
But on average, yes, but not necessarily in every hour. It could be 100 in 1 hour and 0 in another.
I'm just trying to understand the capacity weightings in that table to understand how that calculation works.
Right. It's the potential of the plant. The way to think about that. We have ranked. We have stacked them relative to their total capability.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand exactly how that calculation works for the purposes of your weightings, and I think we got there, but maybe we'll have to double back. Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, can I just make sure that I understand what you're saying then, Ms. Everett? If you look at the updated, the revised table 210 in the response to question 7 of our set 3, it shows renewable have PPA units as having a 222 megawatt capacity for this weighting purpose. So is that the nameplate capacity of the PPOA renewables? Is it the nameplate capacity times a capacity factor or something else?
So just to be clear, you're referring back now to question 7?
Yes.
And table 10?
Yes.
In question 7. Okay. And the 222 in the PPOA is what you're referring to?
Yes.
My understanding is that is the capacity of those plants.
Okay, so that's nameplate, and it doesn't take into account any of the considerations we were just talking about, that you were talking to Mr. LaBelle about. And if you left out the parenthetical as generated from that title, it wouldn't have changed anything, because it's just the nameplate capacity or the maximum capacity of those PPOA units.
This is Attorney Mercado for Luma. I believe the question was compound. Could you rephrase to break it down in different ways?
Yeah. So I guess the first part of that question would be that's simply the nameplate or maximum capacity of the renewable PPOA units. Is that correct?
Is the sum of the expected capacity of those plants? Yes.
Okay.
I'm parsing my words because I don't know if it's quote unquote nameplate, but my understanding is it is expected capacity.
Okay. So if in the example that Mr. LaBelle was talking about before, if you have a wind turbine with 100 kW capacity, that's the most you ever expect it to operate at it in the most favorable winds. That would be counted as 100 kilowatts for this calculation.
That is
right?
correct. Yes.
Okay. So I think the thing that was confusing us is this parenthetical as generated. As I understand your testimony here, that doesn't really affect the calculation of that 222 megawatts. It's more like Well, first of all, is that correct?
It's meant to, so what's included in this bucket of energy, the capacity in this bucket of energy, are resources that may technically not be renewable. And that's why I said as generated. So that it was really meant to be a representation of generation resources that are considered renewable, must run. They basically appear when the fuel appears, and that's why that was noted that way. So they may not be renewable.
So these are units which are dispatched as available, and that's what that parenthetical means, as generated. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say they're not even dispatched. They just appear.
Yes. Thank you. That's all for me.
All right. Thank you. All right. So this next part gets a little confusing because there's answers that refer back to each other. So there's two relevant pieces. One is question 7, which is we just went back to, and then the other is question 17 in the same set. Because the answers to question 17 refer back to these tables in question 7. So hopefully we can keep that all in mind here. So I think the so we asked some discovery about the percentages that were used in these tables. And in question 7, there is now an updated table. There's actually 2 updated tables 2-12 using slightly different methodologies. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so let's start with the first updated table 2-12. That's on page 10 of the PDF. So if you look in the table and you talk about this in the text, the marginal energy costs is now there's a 7.9 cent marginal energy cost. Do you see where that is?
Under dispatchable rates?
Yes.
For 2017?
Yes.
Yes. 7984.
Yes.
Okay.
Great. So in the original cost of service study report, there was a version of this table, and is this updated table replaces the old table 2-12. The old number and then that spot used to be 5.1 cents. Is that correct?
I believe so. Would you like me to double check?
I'm happy to. Well, your lawyer may be jumping in here.
Yes, for the record, I intervene now because this was one request that we had, that I had in my notes for the record, request that the Bureau accept this revised response 7 to the third request for information. So I would ask that this be accepted, and then I would also ask that the witness be allowed to double check the original 212 to answer your question before the record.
You were getting a lot of feedback here. Sorry, I'm not sure who that is.
Can you repeat the?
Yes, sure. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I don't know if it was on my end. I was referring that this
For the record, can you say your name? Sorry.
Sorry, Margarita Mercado for Luma. For the record, I was going to ask the Bureau for leave to accept this revised table that Mr. Lebel is referring to that were submitted in response 7 to the third request for information, revised table 2-10, 2-12A, and updated table 212-12. Those are additions and revisions to tables that were included in the original cost of service study that was filed with the Bureau along with the direct testimony of Margaret Everett. And we would like to admit this in evidence for the Bureau to consider them. And also, my second request was to allow the witness to look at the initial table 212 to answer Mr. Lebel's question on the dispatchable rate that was included in the cost of service study.
I'm gonna ask the commissioners if they have any objection to the petition.
No, for my part.
Then we're gonna allow. If there's not objection of the commissioners, then we're gonna allow, and then you can make reference to the document.
And on housekeeping matter, Mr. Selhammer, would you like to mark this as an exhibit, or is it enough to reference response 7?
We'll let the response, if it's in the record, we'll just allow the response like we have been going on.
Yeah, I just referenced because not all of the responses have been referenced to in the record of this evidentiary hearing or filed for as evidence. So I would request that this
So
one be.
if the request then is if we should mark it, then we can mark it as Exhibit A.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
Go ahead, Mr. LaBelle.
So I think that exchange actually gets at the point I was getting to. Are there in the original report there was in the summary up front, you feel free to check this. There was a table E-1. Are you familiar with that table? Or you can go look at it. If you'd like.
I am, and I'm looking at it right now. Yep.
So in the original report, the marginal energy cost listed in that table is 5.1 cents. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Along with the update to table 2-12, should this now be updated to reflect the updated table 2-12 number of 7.9 cents?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So to get back to question 7 here, just a quick clarification. So fiscal year quarters, just to stick on page 10 of the PDF in the second set of requests from the Bureau, which months is fiscal year Q4 of 2021?
It is March, April, May, and June of 2021.
Okay, so this in this table, that is an updated calculation to reflect the FCA and PPCAs that were in effect for those 3 months?
Correct.
All right, and then fiscal year Q1 2022, which months are those?
Those would be, you're testing me here, July, August, and September.
It is not intended to be a calendar test, just a confirmation for the record of what this represents. So this updated calculation is for the FCA and PPCA rates that are currently in effect during those 3 months.
These are the filed rates. I have not, I did not go back and confirm that these rates were actually adopted. So I will say these were what were filed by LUMA for fiscal year Q1 2022.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, my next questions go over to set number 3 from the Bureau, which is set number 4 overall. Particularly start with question 6.
Okay.
Which is on page 9 of the PDF.
Yes, thank you. I'm there.
Okay, so it's a little bit of a perhaps it's a lengthy question, which may be part of the problem. So the end of part B, we asked about how long estimation of actual hourly generation cost is anticipated to take. So you have an answer here. Is it right that this answer is mostly talking about forecasting?
It's my understanding of the question was regarding forecasting of hourly generation costs going forward.
Okay, sorry, that was not at least my intent in helping the Bureau draft this question. What we were trying to ask about is say we're sitting here on July 19th. How long or when or would PREPA or LUMA, would they know about actual hourly generation costs on July 18th, yesterday?
My understanding is that they currently their processes allow for collection of this data within the quarter. It's various. There's different data collected at different periods of time. Data gets updated. So I think the answer to that question is it's difficult to answer that question precisely because it would depend on the plant. It would depend on timing. My understanding is that they collect this data and they do use actual data and total cumulative cost data, for example, in truing up the FCA and the PPCA. But to know exactly what each plant did and the cost of that plant on July 18th. Firstly, I think there's a bit of a lag. I'm not overly familiar with their processes, but I understand there's a lag. And I would also say that I understand that those costs are not necessarily collected on a plant by plant or day by day or even hour by hour basis right now. And that's why we were saying that it's going to take time to create those processes that are auditable and available to then use in the imbalance rate.
Okay, but that's helpful. Thank you. So then your response to part A here, talking about LUMA's capabilities to implement. Do we need to have a detailed understanding of those current capabilities and what we know when in order to implement an hourly imbalance rate?
I think you need to know what it will be. I would say I don't think that they're in place today, and so these processes have to be determined. And part of the linkage here that we're trying to point out is that the type of data that's collected, the frequency that it's collected, and how it's stored, the processes for quality control is important when it comes and must relate to decisions around how the hourly imbalance rate is computed. So we have to remember that this is a rate that will be charged to ESPs or credit for energy that they were unable to supply their customers, or conversely, a credit that they receive if they provided additional energy above what their customer was demanding. So we anticipate that there's going to be some requirements around the data systems in order to make sure that there's transparency, auditability of the imbalance rate.
Thank you. So what's the best way to figure out what these capabilities will be?
I think that is, again, it's dependent upon what the final rules and what the final Uniform Services Agreement would say. So, I can't put a timeline on it. It all depends, but they are all interrelated. And until you actually, as a utility, until you actually know what you're going to be required to charge, how you're going to be allowed to charge it, will all drive your back office processes to make sure that you're compliant with the requirements and you create transparency around that. So it's a big depends, because you really just don't know until we know what all those rules are.
All right, but then once you have the rules, it takes some time to implement those things in the back office, right?
It does. It takes a fair amount of time, and we've seen direct access markets take a while to mature in order precisely for these process-related questions.
All right, thank you. That's all the questions I had. I think Paul, Mr. Chernick, probably has some separate questions as well.
Before we proceed, I'm going to ask Ms. Everett if she needs a 10-minute recess before we go on, or if you're okay to continue.
I'll always take a break. Thank you so much.
So if you're done, then I'll take a 10-minute recess, and then we'll come back, and whoever has questions, then we can proceed.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Ms. Everett.
Are we ready to proceed?
Attorney Mercado for Luma, I am ready. Let's see if the witness is remote. Yeah, I see her. I see Miss Everett.
Okay. Before we proceed, I want to make sure that any of the interveners that weren't present at the beginning of the hearing is to see if there's someone that has joined the hearing. Ecoelectrica. Is there someone from Ecoelectrica? Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica de la Montaña.
La cooperativa está presente.
Can you identify yourself for the record?
For the record, Ramon Luis Nieves is present. He's the attorney representing the cooperative, and then and the cooperative's executive director, CP Smith, also present.
Okay.
Good morning.
Buenos
Good
dias.
morning. Thank you very much. So then let's proceed with the hearing. Mr. Lebel doesn't have any more questions. I do have to ask Mr. Schertnimick if he has questions. Paul.
I do have some questions, some of them following up on issues that Mr. Lebel covered and some of them separate. I would like to start with the response to set 1, question 1 from Bureau, in which you express concern that, quote, the challenge of computing avoided costs in a situation where a customer chooses an alternative supplier is that the market for energy does not change and thus the capacity needs of the market do not change. I'm just trying to parse that out. Would you agree that the capacity needs of the default supplier change if a customer chooses an alternative supplier?
Only if that customer never returns back to the provider, the provider of last resort, the Polar provider.
Okay, so the issue you're raising there is that a customer signs up with an ESP, is served by the ESP for some time, then allows its contract to lapse, perhaps, and it returns to PREPA supply.
There are a number of different scenarios, but that's basically the idea. Is that a customer has left the Polar provider and then returns later on and is expected to receive full service from the Polar provider, and then the Polar provider now has that incremental capacity cost.
In that situation, for an island system such as Puerto Rico, what do you anticipate would happen to the supplier's generation, to the competitive supplier's generation?
So I would say that my understanding is that the supply of capacity is now going to be handled through a competitive wholesale process, and that Luma, or the Polar provider, will be responsible for procuring energy from the market to meet customer needs. If an ESP has built a generation unit to serve a specific customer, no longer serves that specific customer, that supply may sit idle if it is not awarded as a generation resource for Luma to purchase, or the Polar provider to purchase. So there's two separate processes here, because right now in Puerto Rico there is not a market where customers can bid electricity in that they have available. It is all done through purchase power agreements, or in some cases, where there are some legacy units. But my understanding is those legacy units will also be soon converted to some sort of a contractual agreement. So you could have a situation where that capacity sits idle. It also would perhaps require the polar provider to go out and ask for an RFP, and therefore commit to that energy, that capacity, and therefore then have a long-term contract with respect to that capacity, still facing the risk now that that customer could leave again and go to a different provider. So there's many different hypotheticals or scenarios that one could think of that would occur in this case.
Let me see if I understand your first hypothetical, which is that the customer leaves a third-party supplier, the generation serving that supplier is not able to compete with other resources available to PREPA or whoever is running the system, and therefore it is not selected and it shuts down. Is that the situation you were thinking about?
Not completely. I wouldn't classify it as being competitive or not. I would say whether or not there was the capacity need relative to the planning that PREPA has had. So there continues to be other opportunities that could be cheaper than that resource, certainly. But again, this is a difficult hypothetical because there's so many moving pieces. You don't really know what the situation is, what the customer's load looked like, and so on. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're asking the polar provider to be on call to provide capacity for any customer that leaves their ESP.
But the specific problem that you are suggesting might occur is that the customer leaves PREPA for generation that's built to serve them and presumably other customers, then returns to PREPA, and PREPA has excess capacity and does not need to buy power from the, at least capacity, and maybe energy either, from the generator that served the third-party supplier. Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm saying I don't know what would actually occur. So there's a number of different scenarios. But the point is that the minute a customer comes back, PREPA is on the hook on the day the customer comes back to provide capacity. So even if they are able to go out there and procure, they may not have, they may have a capacity need that they can't meet because the customer has returned to them, maybe even for a short period of time, because we don't know why the customer left. Maybe the unit failed, for example. So that capacity may not even be available. So there's many different scenarios here, and the fact of the matter is that if customers who have departed and are and therefore capacity costs are avoided, they are only avoided if that customer never comes back to PREPA, or excuse me, to the polar provider.
Right. Let's use those terms independently for convenience in this discussion. Okay, but I just wanted to get clear that the situation that you were describing, in which the generation that previously served the customer would not be useful to PREPA. The first situation that you suggested was that PREPA would not choose to use it because PREPA had better options or excess capacity of its own. So I don't see that as being a problem. Is that doesn't leave PREPA with a cost burden if a customer leaves and returns, and that's the situation.
I have an objection respectfully to the question. It's argumentative, arguing a position within the question.
My apologies. I wasn't being argumentative. I was trying to see whether Ms. Everett agreed with that.
We lost connection when
Yeah.
speak.
Mr. Selhammer, on my end, I cannot hear you. I don't know if anyone else is having the same issue.
Yeah, is there a way you can rephrase a question, Mr. Chernick?
Yes.
Go ahead.
You've laid out a number of scenarios as we've been discussing this, and I'm just trying to understand which of those scenarios you think cause a real problem. And I think you would agree that if a customer comes back to PREPA, but PREPA has excess capacity and does not need to pay the generator that previously served that customer, then that is not a problem for PREPA in that situation. Is that what you were saying?
So what I'm getting at, maybe just let's walk through an example. So because I don't want to just confuse anybody. So there's the scenario one: a customer leaves PREPA, leaves the Polar provider. The Polar provider no longer plans for that customer to be in their portfolio, and they in turn provide a discount to their rates to that customer through the supply credit equal to the avoided cost of that capacity. They have given the customer the benefit of the departing customer, the benefit of the energy saving, of the capacity savings. It has not flowed to the Polar provider's customers. It is provided actually to the departing customer through the supply credit in a marginal capacity payment. In that case, those marginal capacity payments are expected to exist through the life of a plant that is used in the capacity estimation. If a customer then returns, it is most likely that the Polar provider will have to go and procure capacity. And they may procure that capacity from the provider that the customer went to, or they may incur that capacity from somebody else, but they incur that incremental capacity. And the customer and now the customer has received a benefit for avoided capacity that is no longer avoided. So that's the key issue here. Okay. And even if departure could occur for a couple of reasons. It could occur because the plant has failed and the supplier is no longer able to supply. It could occur because the provider of last resort's rates are now lower than what the ESP can provide, or the customer is basically unhappy for whatever reason. So there's a multiple of reasons why that customer would return, and what happens is that the customer returns, and if they're placed back on the average rate, they get the benefit of the portfolio for that the Polar provider has, and the incremental cost above that incremental cost that comes in is borne by all customers. So that's the challenge when you think about capacity in the context of Puerto Rico, because there isn't a capacity market. In a lot of other direct access markets, there are month ahead, year ahead, or even 3-year ahead capacity markets that everybody is participating in. So when a customer comes and goes, those problems tend to go away because the market is what the market is. So it's something to pay attention to with respect to Puerto Rico, because that doesn't exist. And my understanding is that there's going to be this competitive process for procuring energy. A lot of that energy that's going to be procured is going to be renewable in nature because of other reasons, and therefore the capacity obligation could be harmful to those customers. The capacity obligation of a customer returning could be harmful to the customers that are currently on. And this is one of the reasons why you typically see indirect access markets, either a separate rate that the customer who returns has to go on, a commitment by that customer to stay with the polar provider once they come back on, or some sort of a buy-in back into the portfolio. So this is not an unusual mechanism to see to address this very issue.
Okay. So if I can boil it down, what I think I've heard you saying is that the problem for the customers who continue to be served by the polar would potentially be that a customer that chooses a wheeling arrangement returns to the system, and when they return, the cost of the capacity that needs to be added by the polar to serve that load is higher than the capacity cost, than the average capacity cost, therefore driving up average capacity costs for the customers who've stayed with the polar. Did I get that right?
There is the potential for that. Or it just ends up being an additional cost. It's just there's all and the problem is that the customer has received the credit of the savings that no longer exists. So that's part of the challenge, is that you've given these customers a discount on you've given them a supply credit that is supposed to represent the fact that these costs are avoided for a long time. And then the customer comes back and now those costs are being incurred. So there's a mismatch there as well.
Mm-hmm. When you say you assume that the cost would be avoided for a long time, if a customer leaves the polar for, I'm not sure what you consider short term, 5 or 6 years, and then returns, and for that 5 or 6 years, the polar does not need to replace aging plants or build renewables to meet the renewable requirement because its load is lower. And then the customer comes back. The savings in that 5 or 6 years has still occurred for the polar, has it not?
It is. It has to some degree, but remember that the savings is a levelized savings. So it's taking the average revenue requirement over a 20, 30, 40-year period and levelizing that.
So if the commission set up a system where the credit was based on not a 40-year period, but a much shorter period, representing the costs that can be saved over the next, say, 5 years, then that would alleviate some of your concern, would it?
Yeah, well, what you're doing basically in that case is really time value of money. So the marginal cost savings would be quite small. So if I have to make 100,000 let's say $1 million investment in a generation unit, if I invest in it in 2022, it's going to cost me a certain amount. If I delay that investment to 2025, I've saved the time value of that $1 million investment, but I still have the $1 million investment. So I would have to compute the avoided costs in a completely different way. I wouldn't compute it as the revenue. The way we compute it today is we calculate the revenue requirement as if the capital was built. And here all we're saying is that we're going to still have that revenue requirement. It's just going to be delayed a few years. So it's basically time value of money of that capital investment. So it wouldn't be it. So the capital the avoided costs would most likely not be great.
Okay. But you're saying there could be some for a shorter period of time, but it might not be as long as a 40-year avoided cost.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. That helps clarify what we've been talking about. In set 1, question 6, part E, in talking about the savings from shutting down plants if the Polar's load requirement declines, you say that if a unit is retired earlier, there is only a cost savings if the plant is already fully depreciated. Now, it was my understanding that if there are undepreciated costs that need to be paid off, then whether the plant is operating or not, those costs will have to be paid off, undepreciated capital costs. And so the savings are any new investment that you would make or operation maintenance costs, refurbishments, that kind of thing. I'm having some difficulty seeing how depreciation affects avoided costs. Could you clarify that?
So if a plant hasn't been fully depreciated, there's still a revenue requirement that persists even if the plant is not operating. So customers continue to pay for the plant even though the plant is not operating.
Right.
So you don't save those costs.
Right. And if it's fully depreciated, then you also don't save any of those costs because there are no costs.
Correct.
Right. So whether a plant is fully depreciated or not, any remaining capital costs are not relevant to avoided costs. Is that right?
Any remaining capital costs are not relevant to avoided costs. Any remaining capital costs that have not been depreciated would not be a cost savings.
Okay. In part F of that same response, you talk about looking at FEMA regulations regarding the avoidability of costs. Did you have any particular FEMA regulations in mind there? And I'm not asking for the numbers of regulations, but the kind of things that FEMA would regulate that would affect whether shutting down a plant or not building a new plant cost would be avoidable.
Certainly. So what we're referring to here is the fact that there has been some FEMA grant funds available to restore plants. From Puerto Rico's perspective, that money is capital infused into Puerto Rico from the federal government. By taking a plant that you plan to restore or refurbish using the FEMA grant money doesn't really create a savings to Puerto Rico. It just means that capital infusion would not occur. And that's what we're trying to emphasize here.
And your answer is based on the assumption that the if PREPA has been hoping or expecting that FEMA will pay a certain amount of money towards the refurbishment of a particular plant, and that particular plant were to be retired rather than refurbished, that FEMA would simply keep the money and not make it available for any other resilience or rehabilitation project in Puerto Rico. Is that right?
The understanding is that FEMA, that PREPA, the receiving entity of the grant money, does not have unilateral authority to decide how to spend that money. FEMA has a say, and so there is an expectation under the FEMA rules that there will that if a plant is retired rather than restored, you can't automatically assume that that grant money can be used for something else.
I understand that, but obviously it has to fit the FEMA regulations. So when you're talking about examining FEMA regulations, are you saying you would want to be sure that whatever money was being freed up by not rehabilitating a plant would be available to Puerto Rico for some other purpose?
Right. In other words, that by retiring that plant, you actually avoid those costs.
Okay.
It's not just that because the funds are designed to, the funds can be reallocated.
Thank you. That's helpful. In Part G of the same response, you talk about avoiding replacement capacity, not that voiding capacity replacement would not reduce long-term costs.
I'm sorry, which one?
This is Part G.
Okay.
And I'm wondering why you're saying that avoiding replacing capacity would not reduce long-term costs.
So life cycle replacement costs are not part of the marginal cost, because marginal cost is creating that linkage between needed load and meeting that with incremental capacity. Life cycle replacement exists to maintain the availability of all plants for all customers. And so when when you're doing your integrated resource planning process, you're looking at plant replacements along with new plant build. And so, and so those life cycle costs are the life cycle replacement costs are integrated into the IRP. The decision making around those life cycle replacement costs are integrated into the IRP. If load is lower, there is a potential that a plant would then be chosen to be retired. Again, that's sort of a hypothetical in a cost of service. As I mentioned before, cost of service studies are a moment in time with a forecast. And so to the extent that those types of decisions and anticipated load departures are integrated in the IRP, then they are integrated into the cost of service. So that's what we're trying to say, is that it just because load depart doesn't mean that you avoid a life cycle replacement cost necessarily.
So if I understand you correctly, what you're saying, if you are in a situation where you're looking at the possibility of needing to add a 100 megawatt unit because of load growth, then that 100 megawatt unit is an avoidable cost. It's a marginal cost. But if you can avoid replacing an existing 100 megawatt unit with a new one at the end of that unit's reliable operating life, then if load decreases, then you're saying that's not a marginal or avoidable cost.
I'm saying it's not as cut and dry. It depends on what actually is in the plan. So right now, we have not been able to identify any costs that are related to meeting or that are related to meeting incremental load. In other words, the load decline. There's a load decline forecast in the IRP, and only if load declines at a greater rate than that would you have life cycle costs that are not already incorporated in the IRP, and therefore savings.
So you're in a situation where the IRP reflects the costs of meeting a particular level of load going forward, which in this case is declining. And if load were to decrease more slowly because of some load growth by some class of customers or some particular customer, then there'd be a marginal or avoided cost of retaining some of that generation or adding replacement generation. So that's an avoided cost. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is what we're talking about here are hypothetical scenarios, right? And going back to what a cost of service study does is it takes an expected case and it says, given this expected case, this is what our costs are going to be, and therefore this is how you would allocate those costs. And so what I'm saying here is that any anticipated life cycle replacement costs that are avoided are already baked into the analysis. There's no incremental avoided cost.
There can't be any? You can't save any costs that are in the IRP?
I'm not an expert on the IRP, so I don't know where.
I'm just talking about a well-done IRP, however you would do it. If it's in the IRP, then you assume that cost cannot be avoided. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying it's planned. So it's not something you should give somebody a credit for doing incremental to what's already planned. So again, what we're talking about doing here is creating a rate that gives customers a credit for leaving the system, because the system will benefit from that customer leaving. If this and so the only way you can do that is a two-step process, which is first determining what marginal costs are, and then secondly, determine whether or not those marginal costs are avoided by the customer leaving. So in the first case, the marginal costs, I'm saying those estimates of the expected marginal costs are part of the cost of service study. The avoidability of those costs, that's one of the things that we were just talking about earlier, is are those costs truly avoided? And that's why, had the fairly long conversation about the customer returning, because the costs aren't avoided. So while I would agree that there's savings from life cycle replacement costs if a system doesn't need to do life cycle replacements, that's an IRP question. And we receive the cost of service study and we compute the cost of service based off of that estimated forecast. I've not seen marginal life cycle replacement costs incorporated into avoided costs calculations. I've not seen that in evaluation of energy efficiency programs, for example.
So it's your testimony that you've never seen the cost of any replacement generation counted as being an avoided cost for DSM purposes or for marginal costs for rate design purposes, that if it's a replacement for a retiring unit, it's not considered marginal or avoided in any study you've ever seen?
What I usually see are an estimate of the forecasted capacity cost that that is the estimate of what the utility would have to spend to serve an incremental kilowatt hour. And that is the cost that's used as an avoided cost number. There are many ways to calculate it, but that is generally speaking how it is done. And so can
I just ask, when you say incremental, do you mean incremental over the load today or incremental compared to the forecast that's in the IRP?
It is the avoided costs are typically based off of marginal costs, which are the incremental costs a utility will incur for creating the capacity in the context of capacity to accommodate an incremental increase in capacity. And that's normally how it is done. Life cycle replacement costs, the way you can think about it is if you're doing life cycle replacement costs, if they are would only play in if they are much cheaper than the increment. You wouldn't get a cost savings unless they're much cheaper. So there's always an economic decision being made in the IRP process that says, is it should I replace this kilowatt? Should I replace this plant or should I build a new plant? That decision is being made in the IRP process. And so whatever the IRP comes back and says, here's what our marginal costs are, here's what we plan to spend for whatever reason, and here's the load growth that goes with that spend, then that is what you compute the avoided costs on.
Okay, I think I understand what you're saying about you start with the costs in the IRP, but then you're limiting the load that's associated with those costs to growth of load from today's level, and that reduction of load from today's level, even if it avoids a cost that's in the IRP, you would not consider that an avoided cost. Is that what you're saying?
Because it's not planned, and yes, because it's not planned to be avoided. So,
well, the new additions are not planned to be avoided either. If there's a plan to build a 100 megawatt unit in 2025, that's planned. It's not planned to be avoided. You're saying that could be avoidable, but if it's meeting load growth, anticipated load growth, but if it's replace an existing unit which needs to be replaced because of existing load, then it's not avoidable by reducing that existing load.
Hi, Attorney Mercado for LUMA. The question began being argumentative, and it's also a compound question. I would object to the question.
Can you divide the question?
I think the best thing to do would just be to leave this here. I think we've probably gotten as far as we can. Okay. In set 1, question 14, part C.
Sorry to interject, Mr. Chernick. I would to request that the latter comment by Mr. Chernick be stricken from the record that we had when he said we have gotten as far as we can. I think that was a remark that shouldn't be on the record. It wasn't a question.
That's fine. It's irrelevant. Go ahead.
Okay. In the response to question 14, part C, you mention that in many jurisdictions with significant renewables and distributed resources, capacity needs are driven more by ramping capabilities. And that sounds like it would be something that would be relevant to Puerto Rico in coming years, given the Bureau's expressed intention to increase renewable penetrations. Can you give us an example or two of those jurisdictions that you're talking about?
So I'm on question 14, but which part are you?
Part C, I believe.
So the question was, are all generation capacity investment costs are incurred to meet system coincident peak loads? Question mark. If so, please explain whether and why PREPA would ever expend additional investment costs for capacity. And I said, my answer was generally and yes. As a region adopts more renewable resources, as you pointed out, expected to happen in Puerto Rico, there must or DERs. The fact that generation capacity may occur in system. I believe what the question was can you incur costs that are not related to coincident peak? And the answer is in places where we see a fair amount of generation that behaves like negative load, the answer to that changes. So what happens in jurisdictions, and I will tell you that you ask for examples of those jurisdictions, they would be Hawaii, California, Arizona, to name a few, where you have a significant amount of generation occurring that is, as we talked about earlier, I'll use the term as generated, but basically a generation resource that appears and cannot be curtailed or dispatched. It appears, and so load could be happening, customer consumption could be happening during times when the transmission system is peaking, but generation is not necessarily dispatching at that same to that same curve. And in fact, as you start to have more and more of these types of resources on a grid, you get what is commonly referred to as the duck curve, which means that what you used to have a fairly gradual incline over the course of the day. It peaks in the afternoon and then it slowly declines. With all of this renewable resource that sort of happens in the middle of the day, we now see a peak happening in the morning, a quick decline happening as solar energy is available, and then a very steep incline to accommodate the transition of generation that is renewable and running as needed versus a dispatch. And so that's what I'm referring to, is that that's not necessarily coincident peak oriented. It's responding to the system that is absorbing all these renewables in order to make sure of reliability.
Okay, and what I'm trying to do here is just find out how you see that affecting the capacity allocator, which would affect the cost allocation and possibly also allocation of any capacity credits that are allowed. So if you wind up in a situation where ramping is driving the need for capacity, how do you see that affecting the capacity allocator? Is that something that the Bureau should be thinking about in setting rates at this point, and specifically the wheeling rate?
So in response to item C, there was a sub-question I asking what would Guidehouse's approach be, and how would you change the classification generation costs? And there we made the recommendation that you ultimately should be thinking about cost allocation based off of net load. And what net load is you take the total system load and you subtract all of this load that I've been describing. So you subtract out renewables. Some jurisdictions, they even subtract out nuclear. And that is the curve that plants are dispatched against. And so therefore, that is the curve that dictates what marginal energy costs are. And this, what we're talking about here is allocation of marginal energy costs. So we would recommend that over time, when this sort of information is available, when it becomes problematic for Puerto Rico as well. There's not a ton of solar right now that really drives the need for this, but in other jurisdictions, they're well past that point. So we would recommend that you start thinking about using net load as your driver of so the driver of cost. Every cost of service study, you have a cost and you have a driver of the cost. We would recommend moving to net load to address this issue once, of course, you can calculate it on an hourly basis. And we do recognize the need that cost of service studies do need to be thinking about ramping. And so to the extent that a customer is self-supplying, for example, they are creating the need for ramping because if they're self-supplying with a renewable resource, they are reducing that net load, and then they're requiring the system to accommodate them when their generation unit isn't operating. So we recognize that, and this is fairly new. I'm not sure of a jurisdiction that is actually explicitly calculating marginal ramping costs, in my opinion. And this was a question about Guidehouse's opinion. Cost of service studies need to evolve to that. But again, I don't think it's immediately an issue. So we did not do that calculation here. And typically, things like the cost of storage would be one option that one could consider to adopt to that.
Okay, so if I could summarize, you are suggesting that this is something that the Bureau should have on its longer term agenda, but that doesn't really need to be dealt with in unbundling or wheeling rates at this time.
Yeah, I think it's a further unbundling of the generation side. And it could result in additional avoided costs, or it could result in additional charges to certain types of customers. If the customer is creating that cost and creating that need for ramping, then that customer should pay for it.
Okay. I'd like to switch to a different subject at this point. And that is, in a couple of places, your responses indicate that you requested data from PREPA related to the IRP and did not receive them. It was not available, or you didn't get a response. Do you understand what happened there? Whether PREPA has lost the data and methodologies from the IRP and just can't access them, or whether they just weren't cooperating with you, or what the underlying problem was, because it seems like there may be something that the Bureau needs to address here.
This is Attorney Mercado for LUMA. In order to know the relevance of this line of question, I would ask that the question be specifically directed to whatever data, particularly Mr. Shernick is referring to, and allowing the witness to review whatever comment was made about data, and then I would reserve the right to object on relevance when it arrives.
Okay.
Can you comply with the request?
Sure. You could look at set 2, question 5. The second paragraph says, Guidehouse did request plant data from the Aurora model, but it was not available. And in set
I'm sorry,
3,
I'm sorry, Mr. Trinick. It's set 2 being your set 2,
yes,
or
okay? Our set 2. I'm sorry.
And question. I'm sorry. I wasn't keeping up with you.
Yes.
Set 2.
The numbering system is complicated here.
Yeah. Which question again, please?
Question 5. The first sentence of the second paragraph in the response.
Okay. Okay. Yes.
And then in our set 3, which would be set 4 overall.
Sorry to interrupt. If we could deal with that first before we move to a second one, for the record to be clear. Sorry, thanks.
Sure, no problem. Can you answer the question, Ms. Everett?
Yes, so yes, we did request the plant data. It was not available. My understanding, it certainly was not because PREPA was uncooperative. I believe the Aurora run was run by a consultant, and the consultant, through practice or otherwise, doesn't provide that detailed dispatch information. And that's not altogether uncommon, because sometimes the models that these consultants use are proprietary. So that's why you don't get. What we did get was all of the hourly marginal costs, I believe, for 4 years, which is included in our work table. So this was, I believe, an issue with the contractual agreements going on between PREPA and the consultant that provided the Aurora model, which, for the record, was not Guidehouse.
Yes. Okay, and then in our set 3, which is set 4 overall, question 15, Guidehouse requested load data but did not receive the reference source file from PREPA.
Question 15, you said?
Yes.
Correct. What we received was the table that we've included in the work papers, but we never did receive the detail behind the IRP. I don't know if that data is available in the IRP. So we did not receive that data. Yes.
Oh. Okay, so is the issue there that you asked for data and you got a certain level of data and you didn't ask for the backup, and that's why you didn't see it? Is that what you're saying?
We asked for the load data. We actually asked specifically for hourly load data by class, but we don't. It does not appear that PREPA has that data. Honestly, not a lot of utilities do, unless they are full AMI implemented. And I want to be clear about where this data is used and why it's relevant. So the data that we're talking about here is the load data that is used to compute a peak and non-coincident peak estimate by customer class. So what we had, we actually felt was sufficient to meet the needs of determining what the coincident and non-coincident demands were. So what we did was we had the system peak, and we have factors that tell us whether or not a customer class corresponds with that system peak. And that's the data that we used, and we had a similar number for non-coincident peaks. So we were able to use the table that we mentioned here to compute coincident and non-coincident peaks that are then applicable to the cost of service. So we didn't make anything up. We didn't shortcut anything. We just used the data that we had. It was a reasonable way of coming up with those coincident, non-coincident peaks that we used for allocation purposes.
Yeah. Okay. I understand what you're saying there, and I was just trying to understand what the data flow or breakdown in the data flow was, and it sounds like you're saying that you asked for some data, you saw that what you got back was good enough for your purposes, sufficiently detailed, and you didn't press the issue of whether there was more detail behind that. Is that correct? Because it didn't matter to you.
It was not relevant for the cost of service.
Right.
I will tell you that as a rate designer, if I was actually designing distribution level rates, for example, which we did not do for this study, I would have pushed harder to get at least a sampling of data, because hourly data, but but for the cost of service study, it was not needed. What we got was sufficient for the cost of service study.
Thank you. And I had, I think, just one more short line of questions, and that is from our set 3, which would be set 4 overall. Question 4, you say something about marginal generation units that confused me a little bit, and I think maybe there's some terminology that I'm not following. You say that the generator that is curtailed may be a lower cost generator than the marginal unit because the marginal unit cannot be curtailed. This is true with certain plant types that are difficult to cycle or ramp. And what I'm wondering is what marginal unit means to you in that context, if it's not the unit that would be turned up or down in response to load or to the generation available from other units.
This is Attorney Mercado for the record. I just want to clarify which question you're referencing to. I haven't been able to identify it.
This is in our set 3, set 4 overall, question, I believe it's question 4. Let me see if I wrote that down right.
I think it's question 13.
It's entirely possible. There are a lot of numbers in all these headings, and I sometimes wrote down the wrong one. Yes, it's question 13.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So it's
Okay.
set 4, question 13.
Yes, thank you. I'm there now.
Okay. So if you see the language about the unit that's curtailed may be lower cost than the marginal unit. And then my question was, well, what do you mean by marginal unit? Isn't the marginal unit the unit that would be turned up or down?
So what we're trying to describe here is the situation typically referred to as overgeneration, where there is a significant amount of generation that is needed, or there's a certain amount of generation that's needed to follow load, but load is not as great as the amount of generation available. And so you end up backing down a unit that is farther down the stack because it's the only one that you actually can curtail or control. The opposite can happen as well. So remember, as we were talking about the ramping, sometimes when there's an abundance of renewable power, you have a situation where you actually have to curtail renewable power because other plants need to run for operational purposes. And so there's a lot of complexities in dispatching, particularly when you get on that margin where of low loads. So it's really easy when you're dispatching on the high end of the supply curve and your units are incrementally dispatching and turning on and off to respond to load. When you get lower into that supply stack where you have resources that are must run, maybe you can't curtail. Coal plants, a lot of times you can only back them down so much without turning them off. A lot of plants don't like being ramped up and down. And so what you do is you might ramp down something farther down the supply stack. So if you have a hydro plant, for example, that can be dispatched, you might back that hydro plant down even though it's economic to dispatch because you have to keep a coal plant running. So those are the types of dynamics that you have to consider at those low load periods or in times of excess supply. And the reason it's relevant is because when an ESP is providing even more electricity than the customer is consuming, that ESP is contributing to that phenomena that supply is coming into the Polar's system, into LUMA's system, and they are having to respond to that extra generation. They don't get to control that generator. They don't get to say, sorry, we don't want your energy. And so that's why you end up with a problem there.
Okay. So the problem can arise, among other things, because you have a take or pay contract in which you don't have the right to curtail a generator that's actually expensive to run.
Correct. Or you would even have a situation where, because it's take or pay, you still pay. Even if you are able to curtail the kilowatt hour, you still pay for the kilowatt hour. And that cost of that kilowatt hour could be fairly high in the resource stack relative to the cost of the resources you're running.
Okay. That sounds like a useful caution about take or pay contracts for units with marginal operating costs. Actually, I did find one more question that I wanted to ask about, and that was in set 2, question 7. And this is something you talked to Mr. LaBelle about at some length, but this is a question you talked to him about. But my question is actually from a different part of your response, and that is from the first paragraph, where you say that you have a problem with using, or you have concerns about using, perhaps, the FCA quarterly filings because the data is quarterly and not annual. Could that concern be resolved by just using 4 quarterly FCA filings? Would that give you the annual data that you're looking for?
I think, yeah, what we're cautioning about, and remember that the numbers that are provided in these tables are indicative, because we're basically demonstrating how you would do the calculation given what the FCA and the PPCA are. And don't want people to think that a 10-cent a kilowatt hour cost in fiscal year Q1 2022 is necessarily representative of what that cost would be year round. So we tried to do that by looking at 2017. I think ideally what you would want to do is you would want to update the supply credit in tandem with the FCA and the PPCA. But if you wanted a hypothetical, you certainly could look at the past 4 quarters, I suppose. But again, that's more. It's an indicative rate. So it was just more to be cautionary that people shouldn't expect it to always be 10 cents. It could be 7, and particularly because generation costs are different times. You have average costs are different by season or by quarter.
Right. They can vary by quarter. They can vary from year to year as well.
Correct.
Right. Okay. Now, are you aware of whether there are any projections for an entire fiscal year in the fuel and purchase power adjustment filings? Whether any of those have?
My understanding is that they are quarter. When that filing is done, it's a quarter ahead look.
Okay. All right. I think that completes my questions. Thank you very much.
May I ask a clarifying question? You made a statement about caution on take or pay contracts. Is that something that's on the record, if so, can I respond, or how does that work?
Well, I'd be happy to have you clarify my assumption about what you were saying.
Okay. Yeah. So I believe what you stated was that take or pay contracts are problematic because of the situation we were walking through. Take or pay contracts are a overall structured contract, and eliminating take or pay may result in other costs being incurred in different ways. So I just wanted to make that point that take or pay contracts aren't bad. They are a way of managing costs. So it's a whole. I just didn't want to leave the impression that that we were not saying that take or pay contracts are bad.
Okay. No, I certainly understood that you were just saying that take or pay contracts can produce that kind of effect. And it seems like the implication would be that it's something that the Bureau should think about in reviewing take-or-pay contracts. But yes, it's certainly, there are lots of situations in life where we have to accept something that isn't ideal because it's part of a package that is the best alternative. Thank you very much.
And just Attorney Mercado, for the record, I appreciate the last exchange, just but to leave it like Mr. Technic issued statements that Mrs. Everett didn't verbalize an answer to the letter exchange.
Before we proceed, does any of the commissioners have any questions?
Not for my part.
No for my part.
Okay. In terms of the interveners, the Independent Consumer Protection Office and Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica de la Montaña, do you guys have questions for the witness?
Yes, we have. Ramón Luis for the record for Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica La Montaña.
Okay.
I guess my camera is. Oh, here we are.
Yeah, you're good. What about the Independent Consumer Protection Office?
Yes, this is Attorney Pedro Vasquez on behalf of the ICPO. We do have some questions to do to make to the witness.
Okay, I'm gonna ask the parties, since it's gonna be close to 11:30 in the morning. I don't want to cut into the questions from either intervener. So do you think it's appropriate to recess and be back at 1 o'clock? And also the witness has been there for a little bit over 2 hours now. So how you guys prefer to proceed? Because we have a scheduled recess at noon. So I would like to know, the extent of your questions, how long you think you're gonna take, and in order to make this decision.
This is Attorney Pedro Vasquez on behalf of the ICPO. From our part, there are not a lot of questions to be made. Still, we have no problem to leave it to after the noon break. So whatever the examiner determines is best suit for the proceeding.
Mr. Nieves?
Regarding the questions of Cooperativa Hidroeléctrica La Montaña, we're in the same position. We have several questions, but if you decide to take a break right now, and we can come back.
Okay, well, I'm gonna defer to the witness, who's the one who has to answer the questions and has been answered for the past 2.5 hours. What's your preference, Ms. Everett?
I'm fine recessing now and taking up at 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock. Okay, then we'll recess till 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and then we'll give the opportunity to both interveners and also to PREPA or Luma if they have questions to their own witness. So we'll be back then at 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good lunch.